It's time for the 24th film in my 31 Horrors of Mike, and this movie is a little bit special. It was released in 1995. The name of it's Citizen X. It was directed by Chris Girolamo, who was also known as the writer of Mississippi Burning. It stars Stephen Rea, Donald Sutherland, Max von Sydow, Joss Ackland, Jeffrey DeMoon, and Imelda Staunton. So with a cast like that, I mean that's a pretty incredible cast. You'd be surprised to learn that the film is very, very little known. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but unfortunately, it's a film that just hasn't really had the amount of credit that it really deserves. But those who have watched it all recognise it to be probably one of the best made for television movies ever made. And not only that, it's also probably one of the best in its genre, but I'll get onto that in a moment. Citizen X follows the Chikatilo murders, which were a series of serial killings from 1978 to 1990, committed by a man called Chikatilo. It was committed during the Soviet Union's reign, and because of that, the Soviet Union didn't want to admit that they actually had a serial killer within their borders. So they tried to ignore it as best they could. They tried to persecute other people that lived nearby where the killings had happened. For example, persecuting homosexuals, those who were already known criminals, and those who perhaps had learning difficulties, to try and somehow explain away these killings as part of some bizarre gang mentality rather than the efforts of one man. And the reason is that the Soviet Union said that the serial killings were something that was indicative of Western society, a capitalist society, and wouldn't happen within a communist state. The film follows Stephen Rea's character, Viktor Burakov, who was a forensic scientist who was put in charge of trying to catch Chikatilo by Donald Sutherland's character, who is a general in the Soviet Union's army. And Viktor Burakov was told basically, try and catch him, but we also don't admit that he exists. So Burakov was given very little to no resources to do this, and spent 12 years of his life, which really brought about an incredible amount of emotional and psychological strain on him as he tried to catch this man. And it's a wonderful, wonderful film, but when you're watching it, you do have to realise that it is based on real life events. Looking at the real life events, I have to say that I'm happy that the film seems to follow what actually happened. Sometimes I wonder whether films based on true events should really be made in the first place. Sometimes I think, look, just make a documentary. I think a lot of historical ideas can be bastardized, unfortunately, when brought into fiction. But in this case, I think they did really, really well. It is a serial killer film. It is also a procedural detective story. But the thing that amazes me about it, well, the first thing that amazes me about it is that hardly anyone knows about this film. But those that have recognise it just as a phenomenal, phenomenal movie. The thing that gets me is this. When people talk about horror films, they often talk about Silence of the Lambs. And the reason they talk about that is because it was probably the horror film which made the biggest breakthrough in terms of critical appeal, and also in the awards, different award ceremonies that won Oscars, and because of that, Silence of the Lambs is held in high regard. Now, I think Silence of the Lambs is an excellent film. However, I think there's an argument to be made that if you're going to watch a film about a serial killer, Citizen X is the one to watch. Yes, even better than Silence of the Lambs. Some people may argue that it's not a horror film, but when I watched Citizen X, it left an absolute feeling of horror within me. So that's all I can say, is that if a film provokes that sense of horror, then the chances are it probably is a horror film in some regard. I think because of the topic of a serial killer type of character, because of that, you know, since things like Psycho and movies like that, and even going into sort of slasher genres and splatters genres where you have murderous killers who don't have a supernatural explanation to them, I think horror has sort of claimed that part of cinema. But Some people would still argue that that's not real true horror, but to me it is, and it's especially horrific because it's based on real events. I mean, the things that Chikatilo did, it's unbelievable that a human being could do that to another person. And he killed well over 50 people. Most of them were young children. And we see the Viktor Burakov character, who's investigating this and trying to catch him, really struggle with this. He struggles mentally, physically, emotionally. His life is dedicated to catching this man, and we see moments of, where the tears are just streaming down his face because he's a father himself, and he thinks about these poor kids being murdered by this man. There are some eerie moments in it as well, because Chikatilo used the rail network to find his victims. So you have these old not abandoned, but run down railway stations, and he would pick people who he could see were on their own, who were travelling, and often these people were suffering from learning difficulties, so he could easily persuade them to come away with him into local woods where he would rape, murder, and also partly cannibalise them. The performances in this film are just staggering. Donald Sutherland actually won some awards for this movie. I think he won an Emmy and a Golden Globe. And as good as Donald Sutherland is in this, Stephen Rea is just incredible in the lead. Really, I felt a lot of emotion watching this movie, and I watched it again recently to try and before I reviewed it again, because it had been years since I'd watched it. But it was a film that had always stuck in my mind. It always stuck there. And when I think of serial killer movies, this is the film that I think of. You may feel a little bit uncomfortable lumping it in with the others because the others are mostly based on fiction, and this film is not, which is always a sobering thought while you watch it. Now, I have to say as well, when we're talking about performances here, Jeffrey DeMunn is incredible. Or is it DeMunn or DeMunn? I don't know how to pronounce his last name. I do apologise. You may have seen him in films like The Mist and in The Green Mile. He's a fantastic actor, but it is single-handed the greatest performance in cinema history of a serial killer. And the thing that creates the most amount of horror in you as the viewer is that you actually sympathise with him. He commits these brutal murders of innocent children and rapes them, does the most despicable things to them. But yet Jeffrey DeMunn's performance is so great that you actually in some places find yourself sympathising with the character and then feeling disgust at yourself for sympathising with him. And what's great about the film is that it doesn't just say, oh, he's evil. It actually shows you parts of his life and how he's this sort of inadequate person, downtrodden in a lot of ways, full of frustration and anxiety at the world around him, constantly with this inability to communicate with people, but also this inbuilt urge to prove himself and to most specifically prove his manhood. And in no way does that excuse what he does. He's a twisted, horrible individual. But Jeffrey DeMunn's performance really makes you not see him as an animal. Now, one of Chikatilo's nicknames was the Beast, and that approach to serial killers and murderers and rapists, where we dehumanise them and we think these people are monsters, that stops us from being able to try to understand them, try to find out what makes them tick so that we can identify it in other people before they kill. And I think that's an important lesson to be learned, and it's one I think that's explored in this film, where as the audience you are made to feel for this man as a human being, regardless. He's not Hannibal Lecter, he's not this caricature of evil. He's not the mad scientist, he's not the slasher in the darkness. He's a human being, And in many ways, that's where the true horror of the film comes from, because he's the type of character who could be your next door neighbour, you know, could be someone nearby who you know, and that's what really makes you terrified when you watch the film. I cannot say enough great things about this movie. It's certainly one of the best made for television films I've ever seen, and I think it's, had it had a theatrical release, I think it would, people would hold it up there as one of the great serial killer films. It all obviously has a limited budget compared to a lot of other films, but the performances, the writing, and the direction just really elevate it to a level that many films dealing with this sort of subject matter just can't even hope to touch. If there was one serial killer film that someone asked me to recommend, it would be this. It wouldn't be Silence of the Lambs. It wouldn't even be something like Psycho. It would be this, because it's the one which is probably closest to the truth, and closest to the bone in a lot of ways. One of the things which is most haunting about it is that the film also explores the ineptitude of the Soviet system at the time, and how it was decrepit, that it was full of corruption, and that it was really dying under its own weight. And there's this sense of stagnancy and staleness within the film because of that, and that just adds to the atmosphere while you're watching the movie. The relationship between Donald Sutherland's character and Stephen Mears' character is just wonderful. Imelda Staunton isn't in the film very much as Burakov's wife, but when she is on screen, as usual, she just gives a phenomenal performance. Max von Sydow is not in the film very often, but again, when he turns up, he's amazing. Joss Ackland, not in the film all that much, amazing when he is. But really, it's about the three main players in the film. Jeffrey DeMunn keeps cutting to his character while he's going on these killing sprees, and then also parts of his personal life, and intercutting with Burakov trying to catch him and the effect it's having on his life. And there are some really emotional moments in the film as well, and that's what elevates it in one way, in one regard as well, is because very few horror films hit you on an emotional level, and this does, because number one, at the horror that Chikatilo is committing, but also Burakov is this tortured man who is good and pure, and he wants to catch this killer, but he's not getting any help from most people. He's not, he's hindered, and it's torturing him. And at one point in the film, we hear that in the FBI that people are rotated every 18 months on serial killer duty, and he does it for 12 years. And the reason they're rotated for 18 months is because of the psychological strain. So you can imagine there's parts of the film where he just breaks down, and the performance is incredible. I cannot recommend this movie highly enough. I really can't. And hopefully this video and other people talking about it will make others pass the film on to other people. And I think it is available on DVD. Certainly you'll find it online in certain places. Watch it. If you can get the DVD, go and buy it, because you won't be disappointed. Just such a fantastic film. And if you aren't into horror as well, bear in mind that it is a detective story as well. So if you aren't into those sorts of films, then it will work for you as well. It's just an incredibly interesting drama, and one which has stayed in my mind since I watched it. And I couldn't believe that it was just this little film that I'd found on television one night that no one really talked about. So that's Citizen X. Go and check that out, and I'll be back shortly with another horror movie review. Bye for now. Sure why that is, but unfortunately it's a film that just hasn't really had the amount of credit that it really deserves. But those who have watched it all recognise it to be probably one of the best made for television movies ever made. And not only that, it's also probably one of the best in its genre, but I'll get onto that in a moment. Citizen X follows the Chikatilo murders, which were a series of serial killings from 1978 to 1990, committed by a man called Chikatilo. It was committed during the Soviet Union's reign, and because of that, the Soviet Union didn't want to admit that they actually had a serial killer within their borders. So they tried to ignore it as best they could. They tried to persecute other people that lived nearby where the killings had. It's time for the 24th film in my 31 Horrors of Mike, and this movie is a little bit special. It was released in 1995. The name of it's Citizen X. It was directed by Chris Girolamo, who was also known as the writer of Mississippi Burning. It stars Stephen Rea, Donald Sutherland, Max von Sydow, Joss Ackland, Jeffrey DeMunn, and Imelda Staunton. So with a cast like that, I mean, that's a pretty incredible cast. You'd be surprised to learn that the film is very, very little known. And I'm not entirely